The proper name is improper. The proper is improper, Derrida is claiming here, on two levels. First, in the colloquial sense, it is disingenuous, improper in the sense that it's disingenuous. Why? Because etymologically the root of proper is the Latin proprius, meaning one's own, right, or special. In this sense, proper names are not proper. I not only share my name, Benjamin, with other Benjamins, but also other Benjamin David Hagans. But even if I were the only Benjamin David Hagan on the planet, or the only Benjamin David Hagan to ever exist, the name itself nevertheless functions as a classification within a set of other possible names. I could have been named something else. Thus my name, is a mere appurtenance, an accessory, not the allusion to a fully self-present entity. Given this, the expression proper name is improper also because it is an oxymoron, that we have forgotten it to be an oxymoron. Thus, all that the girls reveal, according to Derrida, is not their true selves or their real identities, as if finding out that Batman is Bruce Wayne, but that the Nambaquara have already enfolded one another within a fabric of given names and classifications. Quote, remember the end of this paragraph, tearing a veil, hiding a classification and an appurtenance, the inscription within a system of linguistico-social difference. This is going to be important for Derrida later on because he's going to claim that this is already evidence that the Nambaquara are already a people of writing, are already a people capable of writing and inscribing. So what does this have to do with violence? Right? We should ask ourselves probably. Derrida titles this section of the chapter "The Battle of Proper Names" and reminds us in a parenthetical that I actually didn't read here that, quote, we speak here of an act of war. And there is much to say about the fact that it is the little girls who open themselves to this game and their hostilities, end quote. So there is an idiom of violence already at work here, right? And this violence is related to the problematic activity of naming. But where do we locate this violence, right? Where is this violence? For Levi-Strauss, the true culprit is not really the girls, but the anthropologist, and the structure of the violence at work in this otherwise innocuous and even adorable scene, other than the hitting, right, is that of the learned, civilized, but thus corrupted outsider, exploiting or invading or violating what Derrida will call, quote, later in the chapter, a virginal space, an innocent game of little girls, and, since the adults are affected too, the totality of pure, quote, islet of resistance to historical progress, a small community that has provisionally protected itself from a corruption linked, as in Rousseau, to writing and to the dislocation of a unanimous people assembled in the self-presence and intimacy of speech, end quote. That quote is from page 134. For Levi-Strauss, there is then a structural link between writing and violence. They both constitute, as in Saussure, an invasion or corruption of an outside to a self-sufficient, pure, innocent, coherent inside, speech as a subject of linguistics, or the Nambaquara as the subject of the anthropologist. And so, in other words, Levi-Strauss, in linking writing to violence, doesn't actually see violence in the problem of naming in the scene. He sees it in the problem of his own intrusion into this particular game. Right? Derrida will agree that there is a radical affinity, even adequation, between writing and violence, but remember, he has reconceptualized writing altogether as the operation of the trace, as the non-origin of presence or identity, as the production of difference, as the production of texts and fabrics of meaning, writing as différence. So returning to his question at the beginning of the chapter, we might ask, what must violence be if it is, even in part, equivalent to the operation of the trace, if it is equivalent to naming? Before Derrida even gets to the battle of proper names and his difficult breakdown of how he conceptualizes violence, he anticipates the link between the Nambucquaran prohibition of the proper name and the way in which différence, or writing, produces the legibility, or what we often mistake as the essence or essentiality of a thing or a person in the world. Okay. So if you turn to 109, we'll read a little bit of this. Okay. He says, sort of the big the second paragraph on the page, the one that begins before we consider this, but let's put that to the side and just begin. Let us note that this prohibition, right, the law or the prohibition that Levi-Strauss mentions at the beginning of this anecdote, that the Nambucquara don't use proper names, or that they have proper names but aren't allowed to speak them or use them, right? This prohibition is necessarily derivative with regard to the constitutive erasure of the proper name in what I have called arca writing, within, that is, the play of difference. It is because the proper names are already no longer proper names, because their production is their obliteration, because the erasure and the imposition of the letter are originary, because they do not supervene upon a proper inscription. It is because the proper name has never been, as the unique appellation reserved for the presence of a unique being, anything but the original myth of a transparent legibility present under the obliteration. It is because the proper name was never possible except through its functioning within a classification, and therefore within a system of differences, within a writing retaining the traces of difference, that the interdict, the prohibition of the name, was possible, could come into play, could be part of this play and this game and this battle, and when the time came, as we shall see, could be transgressed. Transgressed, that is to say, transgressed, that is to say, restored to the obliteration and the non-self-sameness at the origin. These sentences and these phrases are so deliciously Derridian, right? The idea of being restored to an obliteration, for instance, these sorts of purposeful paradoxes of Derrida's word choices and his diction often accounts for why it's so difficult to think with him, but also for a lot of people who are sympathetic to his style of writing, why people are so interested in how he writes, because he uses, things like paradox and sort of oxymorons and unfamiliar juxtapositions of words and stuff. But anyway, all of that was incredibly confusing, right? And so we know we're in tricky territory here. So how might we reduce this a bit, right? How can we paraphrase it, or how can I paraphrase it a little bit so that it's more concrete? When one names, imposing a proper name as a means to articulate the uniqueness of a person or a thing as a presence, that person's or that thing's uniqueness or properness is at the same time, Derrida thinks, obliterated. For the identity one has produced by naming this thing or person has merely classified that thing or person, right? The identity that has been produced is really just a classification within, an arbitrary classification within a grid of possible classifications. Proper names thus obliterate the properness of an entity, even as it becomes the originary myth of that entity, right? For instance, I mean, how many times have we seen in television shows and movies and films and read in our narratives, right? Scenes in which the dubbing of someone as something, or the renaming of someone as something, or the taking up of a nickname, or of a secret identity, or a donning of a mask, right, is seen as the occasion or the event of an origin of something new, right? Right. So what Derrida is saying is that that event is really just nothing but a myth, right? The myth of the origin of that entity, and is actually the obliteration of that thing's uniqueness. But there's a deeper level to this originary violence, um, uh, 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 and this originary obliteration, right? Why and why? Because impropriety is already there from the start. There is actually no unique thing to go back to before or prior to its obliteration. There is no fully unique singular entity that is fully itself before the naming of it. The proper name simultaneously, one, produces a sense of presence, an identity, or essence. That is why parents often feel the need to make a baby's name feel unique, right? Spelling it a little bit differently or giving it a slight variation in pronunciation, right? Or at least a distinctive name. And also why we produce nicknames for each other, right? So on the one hand, giving a proper name is an attempt to produce a sense of presence or identity or meaning, right? Two, and this is Derrida's point, though he learns it from the Levi-Strauss of The Savage Mind, it is also the obliteration of that uniqueness, since to name is also just to make something legible in a system of classification or in a text, right? And three, it is a disguising of that obliteration by way of the first step. So the production of that difference, right? The production of that myth of origin and of presence is also a disguise of the second part of the fact that that sense of full presence is actually an obliteration of the possibility of an origin or of presence. So I probably have just made you a little more confused. I know at the moment when I'm reading this, I'm thinking to myself, I'm not really sure I'm clarifying much of anything here, but be that as it may, hopefully I'm, greasing the wheels a little bit and getting the gears turning. Okay. Recall that Saussure and Plato have this very concern about writing itself, or about inscription, that writing, instead of preserving a sentiment or mastering communication or rendering something poetic or beautiful, that writing actually signifies an absence, the obliteration of fullness, the danger of error or deviation, the violence of an outside corrupting the interiority of a meaning, an identity, or a sentiment, or an intimacy. Radicalizing this position, as I've said over and over again, Derrida claims, yes, such is naming. That's naming. That's what naming is. That's what writing is. That is the operation of the proper name. That is différance as the originary trace, as originary violence. I should pause here and say that that if Derrida is attempting to insist, right, to insist on the interiority of writing, right, or the exteriority of writing as operating in every structure of reference within the interiority itself, if he's attempting to think writing beyond good and evil, then he is also attempting to think violence beyond good and evil. Originary violence is not bad. It is not evil. It is the only condition, rather, of the formation of form, of order, of communities, but also of deformation and of transformation. Right? If arca writing, différance, violence, is already there from the start, if there is no prior or no before these synonymous operations, what are the consequences of this condition, right? If violence is always already there from the start, the very thing that Levi-Strauss couldn't see in this anecdote of the girls, that he is not the originary violence in the situation, but that the violence is already there from the start. From the very fact that this is a culture that can already classify its members by way of proper names that, even if they are forbidden, are still given in some sense. And because forbidden and prohibited can still be spoken, and in such a way transgress that prohibition, right? And that's all prior to Levi-Strauss's presence there, right? If violence is already there from the start, what good does that do us? Right? What good does that do us? That's the question I want to come back around to for the moment, right? But I want in the next installment to turn directly then to Derrida's attempt to systematize his notion of, I shouldn't say systematize, but systematically break down to sort of three levels how he's really thinking about the relationship between writing, between naming, and between violence. Okay, and it's hopefully there that some of this, if it's still not really clicking or making sense to you, you'll at least get a sense of what Derrida's premises are, even if at the end of the day you're unconvinced that they're useful ones. Okay, all right. So coming back, we'll be reading page 112.